And around this time, the March on Washington was announced, and we secured seats on a bus to go down to take part in it. Unfortunately, most of the buses were canceled because there was a hysterical reaction from the powers that be about this particular march. It was going to be devastating. It was going to be, I think, in short, a bunch of Black people coming into Washington, D.C. and rioting. I think that was pretty much the gist of what was going on. So the bus companies didn't want any part of it. In the face of that, we decided to drive down, and one of our friends rented a car, and we went down together. I also want to point out that in preparation for our going down to Mississippi, the federal government had, to Washington, the federal government had put on alert thousands upon thousands of troops in the Washington, Maryland, Delaware area, so that they would be on alert if anything happened. What I remember about the day of the march is that it was extremely, very, very hot. Hundreds of thousands of people came from all over the country and continued to come through the day. I mean, there were a crowd where you were practically elbow to elbow, trying to move around most of the day. And we kept hearing that there were more buses trying to get into Washington, D.C. So you can imagine the vastness. I don't think that I've ever been in a group or at a demonstration, definitely, where there were so many people. And you would think between the heat and the crowds and everything else that it would be short-tempered. It was not. It was like a love fest. Everybody was just so kind to one another. And it was very, very well integrated, which kind of surprised me in, I think, especially possibly in retrospect, that so many white people did go. There were so many people that they could not march. There was just no room. It was sort of like everybody kind of mushed around, and then we ended up being at the memorial, the Washington Memorial, and the police, who had been given a warning that this was going to be a troublesome crowd, the police were absolutely terrific. The DC police. Now, since then, I've been on marches where the same has not been true, but that particular day, I think they were just so astonished that so many people could come together and behave so well, and be so inclusive, that we were kind to them, they were kind to us. And I did notice, many of us noticed during the afternoon, that as the police went off duty, they joined the march. So that will give you some indication of what the general feeling and atmosphere was. So as I said, there were too many people to march. We kind of surged along. The speakers that I remember most were A. Philip Randolph, who was the director of the march, and he had been the head of the sleeping car porters union for many years, and he had been trying, I think, for something like 35 years to arrange or to work out a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. The other person was John Lewis, whom everybody knows, and unfortunately died this summer. And at that time, he was the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In preparation, all of the speeches had to be apparently shown to the organizers of the march, and they did not accept his. He was sent back to change it, because in part, I believe, he said that if we did not gain what we were hoping for, then there would be a time when people would be marching through the streets of Georgia and through the streets of Alabama, and this was not well received. It was kind of thought of, I think, as being too much of a threat, and that was not the tone that anyone wanted him to reach. He did. Apparently, he made some corrections, but I distinctly remember him saying that we would march through the South, maybe just generally the South, And that was that. And he was very young at the time. And I listened to some of the recordings from when he first was in SNCC, when he was 21 or 22, and he was barely understandable. His speech pattern was so different from the John Lewis that we know from recent years as a state senator. In addition, Rabbi Joachim Pin spoke. And the one thing that I remember from his speech was he said that neighbor is not a geographical term, it is a moral precept. And that stayed with me all these years because it was so, so much to the point. It was so clear and so cogent. And then finally, Dr. King spoke. And everybody knows Dr. King's speech, so I don't have to reiterate that. But one thing that was interesting, and it was brought to my attention at some point over the years, and I have a recording from the March on Washington. And in the background, you can hear Mahalia Jackson saying, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream, Martin." All the way, all the way through, just this little voice coming through. After the March on Washington, and we stayed until we could finally get out. It was the roads were absolutely crazy with all the buses and everything else. It was followed in September of 1963 by the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church, in which 4 beautiful young girls were killed. And then in November by the Kennedy assassination. So that will give you a broader picture maybe of what life was like at that particular moment. In February of 1964, James Baldwin spoke at the Civil Rights Committee of the United Federation of Teachers, which is the UFT. It was my first understanding, actually, of the situation in the South, because during it, he had slides of an Orangeburg, South Carolina protest, the violent police intervention in the protest, and photographs from the hospitals of the demonstrators after they had been attacked by the police. It was, as I recall, and I'm not entirely certain on this, it was almost entirely Black demonstrators who were involved. And it was jarring that the cruelty of it was just simply jarring. It was a peaceful demonstration. It was a march very much like the March on Washington, only maybe with a little bit more determination. And I won't say anger because I don't think anger was part of it. In the spring of 1964, a few things happened. Bob Moses announced that there would be a Freedom Summer project in Mississippi, and he invited college students to volunteer. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever even heard of Bob Moses, but he is a leader who had a spectacular influence on not only the movement, but on my life. Bob died this last summer, and it's just, I'm sorry he's gone. Bob was the person, he worked for SNCC, and he had come into Mississippi in, I think, right after, no, I think he was there actually during the March on Washington. He had been there for about a year or two. And he was trying to start a movement for voters' rights in Mississippi and was not getting anywhere. And his point, which was, I think, made very clear at the time, when he announced Mississippi Freedom Summer and invited in college students, he knew and said that the point of this was, if you get white young people involved in this movement, anything that happens, anything that's brutal or just unconscionable will be made more of because they're white. That was as simple as it was. It was a strategy, it was a tactic. Bob also, his name, Bob Moses, gained a lot of attention in the South because people, Southern Blacks are extremely church-involved people. And Moses was you know, a quick reference, and they started to talk about Moses leading us out of the leading us to the promised land. The character of Bob Moses was such, he was such a very, very quiet, soft-spoken person. He just went about his business and did his business. He was so concerned by that attention that he changed his name to his mother's maiden name, which was Paris. And he was then, you never knew whether to call him Bob Moses or Bob Paris, but he just went on as Bob Paris. At around the same time that Bob announced the Freedom School project, the UFT, the United Federation of Teachers, announced that they were looking for volunteers to run freedom schools in Mississippi. Now, the UFT had done that before in other projects in other states, but this was the first time that they committed to the Freedom School project. In response to that, with a lot of I don't know what the word is, thinking and worrying and fretting and everything else, I decided that I would become a volunteer. And I was kind of the reluctant volunteer because I remember speaking to Norma Becker, who was in charge of it, and saying, you know, I've only been teaching for 2 years. I've been teaching the deaf. I don't know anything about Black history, and I don't know whether I should, but I'm willing. And she said, well, I think you should, because I think that having taught deaf children, you have a unique approach to the problems of youngsters in the South. At the same time, I remember getting in touch with Dr. Drennan, the philosophy professor I had, and doing something similar. And it was simply trying to make sure that I was doing the right deed for the right reason and not the wrong reason. And he wrote back a splendid letter giving me all the reasons why I shouldn't go. And he really didn't want me to go. He said that if you were a boy, I would say, go to it, but no, you really shouldn't do it. And the questions that he led me through, it was about a 10-page letter, going through them one by one and being able to respond to him was what really made up my mind that this was something that I had to do. At that time, I had friends at Local 6, which was the Hotel and Club Employees Union, who very much wanted to involve the union, all the members of the union, in the Freedom Summer, which was exactly what we wanted. We wanted as much press and as much involvement from individuals as we could get, so that Local 6 adopted me as their teacher in Mississippi, which really meant they gave some money to the UFT to cover the cost of our going down. And it meant reporting to them, speaking to them before I went, writing to them while I was down there, and then speaking after I came home. In June of 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner disappeared in Meridian, Mississippi after being released from jail. Now, there had been a church burned down in Philadelphia, Mississippi prior to their incarceration, and they had gone to check on it when they were arrested. In July of 1964, their bodies were found. Now, the word in Mississippi, apparently during that period of time, was that they had, you know, left the country and gone to Bermuda or someplace like that to have a real vacation and laugh at all the craziness that they were causing in Mississippi, that it was just a stunt, et cetera, et cetera. And I think maybe some of the people really believed that in the South. I have no idea. It was such a bizarre thing to me. And their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam in, I think, over the Pearl River. Now, in early August, because I was working on my master's at that time, and I had to have courses done by a certain time, so I had to take courses during the summer, I left for Mississippi in early August. Because I was sponsored by Local 6, there was a photo op at the airport, and it was delayed, and we didn't know why. You know, it just seemed to be taking very long. And it turned out that the reason was that they were removing the body of Andy Goodman from the plane, and I was going to be on the return flight to Jackson on that same plane. And it stopped me. It was a very sudden reality check. I mean, it made me think, do you really want to do this? Is this something that you really want to do? In spite of the fact we did have to make up wills before we went down. We were requested to do that. It was suggested, I suppose. But something about that particular moment and that particular event made me realize that this was deadly serious. So we had our photo op and I went down. When I got to the airport, a young Black man came up beside me and took my suitcase and said, looking straight ahead, he said, "Are you going to COFO?" Now, COFO was the name of the umbrella group that ran the Mississippi Freedom Project. It involved CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SCLC, Dr. King's group, and several other groups. And I was stunned, really, that someone would know just by looking at someone in an airport that was what they were doing. And he took me out to a car with a Black cab driver that got me to the COFO office. Now, after I got there, I was sent to Tougaloo College, which is a Black college in Jackson. And that was for an orientation session. And Bob Moses spoke at that. He was very, very eloquent and very moving about what needed to be done. Very calm. Bob always spoke very calmly, and it intrigued me that he had such a wonderful grasp of situations that involved young people, even up to the point of like the 50th year reunion or the 60th year, well, that hasn't happened yet, but the 50th year reunion. I remember we were in a room and there were a bunch of high school kids that were trying to, start something, get something started. And they were in a little room off the main room. And Bob went in, and you could never hear what he was saying, but he said something for no more than about 5, maybe 10 minutes, and everything was calm. He left the room. The kids were totally directed in the right direction, were able to figure out what they were going to do, and it was their project. I mean, Bob had just influenced them to a point of directing them. At Tougaloo, where Bob spoke, he had a lot to do with the orientation session. We stayed in the basement of the dormitory building because people came to shoot into the dormitories over the weekends, which was when we were there. It was an eye-opener. Everything was an eye-opener. Everything was so new. From Tougaloo, I went to Jackson. There were no freedom schools in Jackson yet, so I had to do other things, which was just, voter registration, or not trying voter registration, but encouraging people to vote, and office work, whatever needed to be done, I did. They didn't have freedom schools in Jackson yet because Jackson was considered to be more dangerous than the rural situations, which I find in retrospect very, very interesting. They did, before I came home, they did open a school on it was called Mount Galilee, was the name of the church. And I think it was only open for about 2 weeks because it was so late in the year. Number one, it was close to the end of August when it opened. And number two, the project actually closed when everybody left to go to the delegation in the Democratic Convention in Jersey City. But for the time, we had mostly high school kids. Because of my background, was outside with the dozens of kids who were, I would say, 7 years and younger. And we just did, because they were so young, it didn't make any difference what I knew about or didn't know about Black history, because you just did the ABCs, counting numbers, you know, just tried to get them very basic concepts. Now, the general atmosphere in Mississippi was extremely tense for us. It was, you just never knew it would happen. And I know some friends of mine have told me that when we used to go to the Freedom School, we walked along the street and there were always guys standing there with tire irons, just kind of swinging them back and forth, like threateningly. And I have absolutely no recollection of this. I think it must have been some kind of a maneuver to keep everything at bay. I just wasn't aware of it. We did have a Watts line, which was a closed circuit telephone line, so that anytime we went anywhere, we would have to call in as soon as we got there, and vice versa, call back after we had returned home. And I think now with cell phones, how much easier that would have been, you know, for all of us, because sometimes it wasn't easy to get to a phone to be able to place a call or to find someone who had a line that would get you through. While I was there, I went to the memorial service for Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner at the site of the burned out church in Philadelphia. And that was, I mean, it was the church had actually burned to the ground, and it was on this surface that there were chairs set up, and Mrs. Cheney was there. And of course, Rita Schwerner was still working in Mississippi, Mickey Schwerner's wife. And I think that Andrew Goodman's mother or father had come down. And that was extremely, extremely moving, especially the Cheney family, because James Cheney had a young brother, Ben, who just could not deal with his death at all. And he was just totally dissolved during the whole thing. So that was a terrible reality. Then before I had gone to Mississippi, I read a book by James Silver called Mississippi, the Closed Society. And he was a professor at Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. And after I had come down, I had written to him and I had asked him if I could see him while I was down there. And while I was down, my sister received a call from him and gave me the number to call back. And anyhow, we arranged to go and see him at Oxford. We drove, there were four of us, Janice Grant, who came from Maryland and was a teacher also, Morris Levine, who was also came from New York City and was a teacher also, and Ursula Jung, who was from Germany and was, she had just volunteered, and she spent her whole life in Mississippi, actually. She continued working down there until, I think about 2 years ago, she returned to Germany and died. But we went down anyhow, and we made the mistake of knocking on the wrong door, even though these were all professors' homes. The professor who came out was almost a caricature of a redneck, big white, very, very overweight, in his shirt sleeves with a bottle of beer. And he lived next door anyhow. He did direct us to where Dr. Silva lived. And we spent, I think, about 2 hours, mostly, as I recall, arguing. Not myself, but Janice really got into a terrible argument with Dr. Silva about the perception of Black males. And I'm never quite sure of how they got there, but I do remember Janice saying something about, like, that you, so far as you're concerned, my father is just an old buck. And I thought, oh, gee, where are we going here? But we ended harmoniously and left. And while we were driving home, we got to a small town. I thought it must have been hours from Mississippi, but it really wasn't. It was only about 20 minutes outside of Jackson. I'm sorry, not Mississippi, but Jackson. And the car hit either a deer dog, we never did find out what it was, and the radiator cracked. And here we were at midnight in a town called Midnight in Mississippi, in an integrated car where Jews are regarded as poorly as Black people, so that there we, and foreigners, of course. So we had a little hobnob and decided that obviously somebody had to get back to Kofo. No, we didn't have a phone. We had to get there. And it couldn't be Janice because she was Black, and it couldn't be Morris because he was Jewish. So Ursula and I, with the instructions that Ursula was not to open her mouth because she had a thick German accent, hailed a ride with a young couple that had, I know that they had 2 little children who were in their pajamas. So, and they were just so lovely, and they wanted so much to take us to wherever we were going, which was obviously not, I was not going to say it was our Kofo. I said that we had relatives and we were visiting from the north, etc. And I kept saying, no, you can just drop us at the Greyhound office. We don't want to put you out. And then finally there was a moment where everybody realized what was going on here. And I don't know who was more afraid, the people who drove the car or us, because they just became very, very silent, and they did take us to the station, to the Greyhound station. We were very grateful, and somebody drove out and saved Morris and Janice. Janice was in the boot of the car because some people had come up to the car, and Morris was under a blanket in the back seat of the car because they had locked all the doors, but they realized that they couldn't stay there. The one thing that I do want to talk about, because when people hear about the civil rights movement, especially the Freedom Summer, they always think about how great it was that all those kids went down, and they volunteered and they faced danger and all that. The real heroes of the entire movement were the people who lived in Mississippi, the people in the Black communities who opened their homes and their hearts to us, fed us, clothed us practically, and they were in grave danger. And it never really went out of my mind at any point while I was down there that these people had to live there after we left. And I could get on a plane and leave whenever I wanted to, or get on a bus and leave whenever I wanted to. But these people had to live with this and the repercussions when there weren't white people around who were, sympathetic to their movements. And many people lost their jobs, their homes, and everything else because of their involvement in the movement. And with all the books that have been written, I don't think enough attention has been paid to that. The other thing that it's just a story, we were told never to travel in intersexual groups. And there was a night that there was a cafe that we used to go to. Mississippi is a dry state, so that there was never any liquor involved, but it was just a place where you could kind of hang out and wind down. And I think it was because of it was circumstances anyhow that found me with 3 Black men in the car going over there. One of them was the driver, and one of them was going to drop us. And we got behind, we got in front of a police car, and we got to train tracks, and there was a freight train coming through. And it was just at that point where the headlights were on from behind us so that they could see who was in the car. I had slipped down to the floor, and it was the longest, most interminable half hour or so in that car, with all the tension of being, again, in an interracial, intersexual grouping. Then that wasn't bad enough. We got to the cafe, and the cafe was closed, as it turned out. The car had left that had driven us, and it was myself and these 2 young men, Stu House, who was from Detroit, and Jimmy Womack, who's from Canada, who were stuck on a dark street in Jackson after dark. So the Men's Freedom House was at the end of that block. And we started to walk to the Freedom House when we realized that there was a car that was right next to us, just coming very slowly right next to us. Now, we had been trained that if anything happened where we were confronted and we were in an interracial group, that always the white person got to the outside, got between the people who were harassing and the other members of the group, the Black people. And that's what I did. I can tell you I was shaking. And these people wanted to know where I was from. And there was a gun. There was a very obvious gun in this picture. And I said that I was from New York City. And I'm very soft-spoken, and I think that was it. I don't think they were being smart, but they said, you're from whatever the name of the street was. You're from this particular street. And I said, no, I didn't say that. I said I was from New York City. And nicely, politely. And nothing happened. I mean, they just were there, and, you know, there was this tension, and all of a sudden I said, well, let's just walk. So we walked and they drove, and we got to the Men's Freedom House. And that's where I stayed the night, which was really a big no-no, but there was no way I was going back out on that street. The other thing that I should mention before I go on to Selma is that the music was constant, and this was true all through the movement. It was a constant part of it, and it was just it was necessary because it broke the tension. It kind of I don't know, it kept our spirits up. It broke the tension, but everywhere there was music. Mostly, I'm talking now about protest music, but also the music of the time. You know, we had the Supremes and the Temptations and all those folks, but it was very, very important part of the movement. Now, I can't remember. No, I don't remember that very much that happened between Mississippi. I mean, I got home. There was a moment of total disorientation after I got back to the city. And then friends of mine from the movement came, and it made things much more palatable. I also had speaking engagements because of the Local 6, which I had to, report back to, and I had been writing to anyhow during that period of time. And I had a speaking engagement at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, in Eastern Pennsylvania. And I mention this because my father came with me, and my father was actually furious with me at that particular moment because my mother had, and he himself had been absolutely devastated during the period of time I was down there. They just didn't know what to expect and what might happen. And since I had been back, we had always been very close, and that was coming back again, but there was a lot of tension in the family. So when I went down to Lafayette, Dad came with me, and it's the first time and the last time in his life that he told me afterwards that he was really proud of what I was doing. Then I had friends staying with me, as I told you, during that period of time, and I went back to school and life went back to normal until March 7th of 1965, when we were watching Judgment at Nuremberg. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but it was about the people who had acted as judges under Hitler were themselves being judged, and it was a long time coming. And in the middle of it, there was a bulletin about Bloody Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where the members of the community had been and with their leaders had gone over the bridge and were faced by the police. And I'm sure most people have seen photographs of that. The police beat them back, and it was a bloodbath, actually. That particular thing happened in the middle of judgment at Nuremberg was, I think, an immense irony to me, that something that was so devastating and so parallel in many ways to what had gone on in Germany could coincide at a given moment. During the weeks that followed, Dr. King appealed to churchmen to join the struggle in Selma. I knew the minute I saw it that I had to get down there, and so I connected with a friend. Oh, he wasn't a friend at the time. He was a former freedom rider, Al Gordon, and we both arranged to take leaves of absence from our schools and go down. I remember around the 13th going to an Odetta concert, at which point she sang as an encore, Ain't No Grave Gonna Keep My Body Down. And she dedicated it to Jimmy Lee Jackson, who had been killed just a couple of weeks earlier in Selma. Actually, he was killed, I think, in Marion. And to James Reeb, who had been attacked and killed just that week. Around the 14th or 15th of March, I went, Al and I went to Selma, and we were assigned to live with Mrs. Howard on Eugene Street, and her children, Thelma and Bubba, who were both teenagers. And we got a lot of information from them about, well, just what it's like to be in the South and be Black. Mrs. Howard worked at a cigar factory, and she left the house somewhere around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning and got home at about 6 o'clock in the evening. And yet she had time to take people in, and she had time to look after her children and make sure that they were doing their homework and everything else. Thelma and Bubba told us that their school received the cast-off textbooks from the white school in town. And we could see they were terribly outdated, all of the books that they had. And it just a waste of young minds. Mrs. Howard, to me, was a monument to endurance. She couldn't herself take part in all that was happening in the community, but she could do what she could do, and that was giving up her home, or giving up part of her home to these people. And she told us at one point that there had been 2 people staying there before we came, and they took her blankets. So that, you just wonder how people can stand it, and how she could then open her home again after having had that experience. During that week, there were several demonstrations. There was almost every day there was a march down to the city hall to get people to register to vote. And almost every day we would turn back. There would be a procession. I think that they limited the number of people, and so people took turns going on the procession on the streets over to the place where they could register. And then when we were stopped, everyone would kneel, and there would be a moment of prayer, and then we would just return to where we were. At some point, James Reeb, who was a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he was a wonderful speaker, and he decided that since we had all these people in Selma, that we should use the time well, and just organized a march one day to the mayor's home, Mayor Smitherton, I believe his name was. And we went, and we were arrested, and we were brought back to the community center, not to the community center, but to the police station. And I remember while we were there, we were out in a courtyard. Now, this was different from Mississippi. because there were television cameras all over the place. I mean, they just, so that there were cameras on us there. And there was a young man who was behind me who bore a striking resemblance to pictures of Jesus Christ, who was absolutely terrified. And I kept saying to him, look, you know, if anything happens to you, it's going to happen on camera. It's not the kind, this is not the kind of situation where you really need to be frightened. In the meantime, on the sides were all of these Southern police officers who were taking pictures of us. And that was supposed to be intimidating, I suppose, I don't know. We were taken inside and booked. And there is a rule of thumb in the movement that if you're in a situation where it's integrated and something needs to be done or addressed, make them address the Black person in the group rather than the white people in the group. And vice versa, if one of you is to speak, let it be the Black person. And I remember one of the police officers said something about, is it hot in here? And a couple of people said yes. And then they realized that they were misspeaking because they were not the right color. And finally, one of our Black members said that we really need an open window, and they would not hear him. They just, I mean, it was really stifling in the place, and they had to be as hot as we were, but they would not hear him, and they would not open the window, which will give you an idea of how horrible the situation was down there. We were placed in a community center that night. We segregated ourselves, women upstairs and men downstairs. And actually, we knew that the door was open, but we didn't know it was outside the door. It was unlocked, is what I mean by open, but we didn't know, and it was nighttime, and it didn't seem to be a good idea to say, well, they were breaking out of prison, so we had to shoot them, and that could easily have taken place. I think maybe a day or two after that, Al and I joined a contingent of Unitarian ministers who were going to Montgomery. And this was the day we were joining a march, because there had been a very brutal police put down of a march there 2 or 3 days before that. And we were joining a protest march about that. And we were arriving at the Capitol building, where Dr. King and James Foreman, who was at that point the head of SNCC, were meeting with Governor Johnson, maybe Governor or Attorney General Johnson, I think it was the Attorney General, to secure a permit to march from Selma to Montgomery. And while we were there, it had started out in the 70s. There was a horrendous storm, and there was not only thunder and lightning and hail, but the temperature dropped into the 40s. So it was freezing outside by the time the evening came. And Dr. King came out, and I think it was, I can't remember who was with him. Dr. King came out at one point and announced that there was still a negotiation, that nothing, nothing more had come from it. So while he was speaking, Andy Young came out and whispered to him, and he said that the judge had just agreed and we had a permit to start the march. So that was wonderful, and the crowd, in spite of the weather and everything else, the crowd was really delighted. So we returned to Selma, and I'm trying to think, there was something else that I had wanted to mention to you. That we did, that being arrested. No, I can't remember. It was important, but I can't remember what it was. So after that, we went back to Selma, and we had a lot of meetings at the church at Brown Chapel, and we finally got to Sunday. And on Sunday morning, we met at Brown Chapel, and there was an interfaith service that was there. And at this point, the clergy all over the country of all denominations had come in, which made me very happy, because this was a consideration of mine from the very beginning of where are the churches, where are all of the people of conscience, of the religious people of conscience. They're not here. And they did turn out for Selma, and that was very heartening. And looking at all the people who were there in front of Brown Chapel, and hearing all of the different religions give homilies before we left, it was Dr. King's beautiful community. It was something that just made so many things in life seem possible if people could just for a moment live like this, just live together. So from there we took off, and the march began with, I think, the people who were going to march to Montgomery plus 1,000 other people for the first 7 miles. And then after that, only the community people and Dr. King and those, anybody else who was in that contingent were permitted to walk past that point. It was limited to a number. So we walked out, and we walked over the bridge, and the same troopers who had been there on Bloody Sunday were there, only this time they were presumably protecting us, which was an irony. And there were helicopters all over the place, I remember that. And one of the things that intrigued me was that on the side of the road, you'd have a bunch of white people screaming obscenities at us. And within touching distance, there would be a group of Black people who were cheering us on. And they never acknowledged one another. Neither group acknowledged one another. It was just an incredible situation. And then there was something else that I did want to mention, because I was always of the mind that it was, obviously we were there for the Black community and to integrate, but I did not dismiss the white community as easily as many of the people that I worked with did, because I did not, to me, it was an opportunity for everybody to learn, and you just never knew what those people had been through, aside from living in this culture, to be so blind to reality. And I remember one day, Al and I were walking down the street in Selma, and there was a grandfather there with a little boy, and the grandfather got down on his knee, and looking right at us, he said to the little boy, "I want you to look at them so that you'll know what a white nigger is." And I thought, this little boy is 4 years old, and I will bet my life on it that grandfather was 4 years old when someone did exactly the same thing to him. And the only thing that you could do was to look as lovingly as possible directly at that child, and hope that it would create doubt in his mind about what his grandfather said. But it stayed with me for a while, and the impossibility of such a situation stayed with me for a while, until just a couple of days later, we were walking back to Mrs. Howard's house, and we were at a corner where there was a little store, and a pickup truck pulled in with 2 white teenage young men. And one of them, the one who was driving, called us over. Now, Al didn't want to go, but I said, "Go. We're here, we're in the open. If anything's going to happen, it's going to happen anyhow." So I went over, and the young man really wanted to know why we were there, why we thought that Black people were equal. What was it that brought us to this place, and what was he not seeing, basically, was what it was about. And his friend was dismissing him like crazy, but he was very serious. He really did want to understand why we were there. And I talked to him, for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, just, one thing to another. And he was not persuaded. Obviously, he wasn't persuaded, but he was still doubtful. And I said, maybe in 5 years, or maybe in 10 years, you'll be able to see what what is happening here. Maybe when you get out of the South, maybe when you visit other places and meet other people, you'll be able to. But for me, it answered the question of that little boy and his grandfather, because this young man had grown up in Alabama as well, and he was experiencing doubt about his own situation. And to me, that's the beginning of all learning. So I often wonder what happened to him. So after the march, after we had taken part in the march, to the first 7 miles of the march, Al and I returned first to Selma and then back to New York City. Coming back to New York City this time was also, it was a little difficult, but it was not as hard in some ways, but in other ways it was, especially when Mrs. Viola Liuzzo was killed just a short while later. And people would continue to be killed. Jonathan Edward, who was a young Episcopal seminarian, was killed, I think, in May in Selma. And I didn't learn about that until many years later. I just, the papers covered it when there was something happening, but when there wasn't anything big happening, they did not cover it. And there were so many people who lost their lives, mostly Black people, whom the world will never know about. So I returned to Selma again the year later, and spent an afternoon with Mrs. Howard there before I went to Mississippi, where I volunteered both in the summer of 65 and 66. At this point, the movement was changing, and it was, I think, right after Selma that Dr. King wrote a book, Where Do We Go From Here? And he started it by placing Selma as the center of an X, a big X, and from that point on, he felt that the races were going to diverge, and that is exactly what was happening. And I think Black Power was coming up at that point too. And it was a very serious decision within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that the group separate, because they felt that the Black leaders needed to address the Black community themselves, and that it would be better for white people who were also organizers, some of them, to return home and work with white people in their communities, which unfortunately I don't think they were prepared to do. And my final participation in the Southern movement was in 1968 after Dr. King died, as Crystal had told you before. And from there was a contingent going on to Atlanta for Dr. King's funeral, but I was not able to do that. And that's my story about being in Mississippi. And I do know that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is still around in a sort of advisory state, was called upon by Black Lives Matter during the demonstrations during the past couple of years. And I was very happy to hear that connection was made between these two eras and between these two times. I can imagine it would be very beneficial to all involved. And I thank you all for being here tonight, and hope that was some enlightenment or help or something. And I'd be anxious if you have any questions.
Thank you, Susan, so much. If anybody has any questions, they can either unmute or put them in the chat box. We're getting some thank yous in the chat box now. What would you say to the youth today if they were interested in taking part, in these activist movements? What would be your, advice?
I think the first thing for any young person is, before you get to the point of being active, is to be connected, to connect to people and to organizations that are doing things that benefit the community. then I think you're in a position when it comes to activity to make a more enlightened decision about whether this is something you do or do not want to take part in. I feel in one way that every person should have the experience that I had in the South, but that's not, it's not necessarily possible. I mean, I think you look at the present moment, and you can't plan for what's going to happen. And I mean that the Freedom Summer took place when it did was a surprise to everyone. It was certainly a new way of dealing with things and looking at things. And you never know what's going to happen, as within the middle of a pandemic, all the people that came out on marches this year. I mean, I think that was last year, this year. I think that was extremely heartening. And I think that there has been a tremendous dent made in the white community in general. And I do not think of most white people as being racist. I think of most white people as thinking it has nothing to do with them. I think that finally people are beginning to realize that, hey, it does. So for young people, I would say, stay connected to people or organizations that are dealing with the injustices of today. And if it comes to volunteering for a particular thing at any point, just look at the situation and determine whether this is a good fit or not for you. Is this something that you would be good at? And is it worth whatever risk there is involved to participate?
Good advice, thank you. Anybody else has a question?
I have not a question, but just a comment for Susan. Thank you so much for that inspiring talk. You mentioned Andrew Goodman. Andrew Goodman was a student at Queens College at the time, as was I. So being a classmate of mine, I didn't know Andrew personally, but I know once the report that he was murdered in Mississippi, there was just such shock and disbelief on the Queens College campus, and it just put everybody in such a somber mood.
I'm sure it did. And one of the interesting things about Andy is that he apparently, it was his first day in Mississippi when this happened.
Yes.
He had been in
Yes.
Ohio at the
Yes.
training school there, and he and Mickey Schwerner, and I think Bob was with them, went back down to Mississippi, and it was the very next day that terrible thing happened.
Yes. Thank you again.
You're very welcome.